Good luck, Emma.
Okay. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for that gorgeous introduction. And thank you all for joining me today. So if we just head to the next slide when possible. So today, hopefully, our learning intentions are to discuss and reflect upon neurotypical brain development during adolescence, brain injury related behaviours versus neurotypical related behaviours in adolescence. And then to really think about co-occurring considerations, so things like capacity, risk taking, and social vulnerabilities. So if we begin and start with looking at neurotypical brain development during adolescence. Okay, so it can be really helpful to begin by defining what adolescence is. And, there's been many researchers which have described this a lot better than I could. So who have kind of summarized it as a phase of life between childhood and adulthood. I really like Blake Moore's description with starting with the biological, hormonal, physical changes of puberty and ending at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. And again, researchers have stated that there's three primary developmental stages of adolescence and young adulthood, that being early, middle, and late. Now, when you are a teenager and you're going through those stages of adolescence, life can feel really, really tricky. So let's look at why this might be. So the brain in general can be viewed as being constructed in first, and in terms of its function, it's the most basic. It's the brain stem, and it's responsible for tasks essentially to keep us alive. So breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure. We then have the middle layer, and this is the limbic system. For anybody who has worked with me before, worked jointly with some of my teenagers, just because I can see some of the names, this is what we would term as the chimp, from the Chimp Paradox by Professor Steve Peters. So it's the limbic system, which kind of deals with our primitive or motivation drives. These are things like sleep, pleasure, fight or flight. Now, the top layer is the cerebral cortex, and this is kind of the most sophisticated. This is where the most sophisticated forms of complex decision making are dealt with. Now, that middle and top layer are split into two linked hemispheres, each containing four lobes. And largely, for the most part, particular functions can be linked to each hemisphere and lobe. Although I think it's really important to remember that the brain is a processor of varied, diverse, and intermingling data streams, and lots of functions kind of have a diffuse spread across the whole of the cortex. But generally speaking, the occipital lobes at the back are dedicated to processing visual information. I always like to remember it as we've got eyes in the back of my head. We've got the parietal lobes, which again relate to visual and spatial information, but in 3 dimension. And it's vital for sensory perception, integration. We have the temporal lobes, which for the most part are a memory store. And then the frontal lobes, which are by far the largest and associated with kind of the higher level executive functions. Okay, so if we pop to our next slide. So in terms of brain development, we are born with a fixed number of neurons at birth, but the density changes over time. So that's how our brain develops, it myelinate. And we have peaks in development throughout our life, but there's some major peaks that, well, we can't really see. What we can see is usually just a very small indication of the huge biological and hormonal changes that are happening within ourselves. But these tend to be around the ages of 3, 8, 11, 15, and then later again at 19. Now, the brain continues to develop well into the 20s, and lots of researchers advise that full maturation is expected between 25 and 30 years. So, really, what I was saying then, we can see kind of the synaptic density of neurons in this image here. So, at birth, we have the same amount of neurons, but they're very sparse in terms of the connections. If we look again at the later stage of 6 years, there's lots and lots of connections which reflect experience. So that's how we learn when we're younger. We experience, we sensation seek, and go to school, all of that. Lots and lots of connections are forming. Now, when we get a bit older, at age 14, we begin to kind of prune, so pruning of those structures. And that process is the process of removing neurons that are no longer used or useful. And then we reinforce transmission within pathways which are more important. So the brain is constantly evolving and densing and pruning, and it all is dependent on our experiences and learning. So over late childhood and adolescence, there seems to be a real lack of synchrony or a lag in the development of two really important brain structures. And now these are the two which actually enable fully adaptive behaviour. So essentially, one develops quicker than the other. There's been lots of studies which have shown that young adults and adolescents are a lot poorer at responding to problem-solving tasks when the complexity of emotion is added. So there's a gap really between reasoning, logical thinking, and emotions. However, this gap is made a lot worse by an underlying susceptibility for responding to immediate rewards that emerges in teenage years. There's like a surge of dopamine and positive sensation seeking neurotransmitters. So what it seems then is that the brain system that's kind of related to rewards and immediate rewards as well is developing super, super quickly, especially in comparison to some of the other systems that might regulate it. So in comparison to, say, the frontal lobe, which is continuing to mature way into kind of early adulthood. Essentially, then, what this means is that the teenage brain, it has an adult-like ability to reason, but it has a heightened need for basic reward and a lowered capacity to filter immediate influences, potential short-term versus long-term gains and rewards, and especially in the context of peers. So what we might see, and again, if we're thinking of expected behaviour, you would probably say it's quite typical that somebody in year 10 or year 11 doesn't want to stay in and revise. They want to go to somebody's party. So that's a context involving peers. It's short-term gain, and it's going to have lots of libidinal kind of rewards there, tribe, party, fun. So that is just a really kind of simple and common example of how we might see some of these biological features show up in a day-to-day life. Now, at the bottom, I've popped a link. It's by Hugh Williams, and it's Repairing Shattered Lives. It's amazing in terms of summarising brain development, TBI. It's a really, really useful resource, and a lot of kind of the discussions that we've just had have come from that. So I just wanted to pop that in. It's a free resource and it's super helpful. So yeah, make sure you look for that. Now, the teenage years are also a second window of opportunity. So infancy and adolescence are both periods of rapid change and development. And with young children, we really nurture them, we really set them up for life and prepare them. However, the ages between 9 and 14 are equally as important. And it's again another opportunity to nurture children's brains. But how do we respond to teenagers or early adolescents during this time? It can often be misunderstanding them, And you know what, rightly so, because I work with teenagers, and they can often pose many challenges in the way they interact or what they want to do. But if we just compare those two windows of opportunity, how do we respond and nurture the teenager versus how we respond and nurture the infant? And I just think it's really important to bear in mind. Now, on the next slide, we have a video that can explain some of this much better than I can. So it's not too long. So let's quickly have a look at this.
We used to think the shaping of brain wiring systems tapered off after early childhood. But neuroscience tells us the brain goes through another rapid phase of change from age 9 to 14, a second window of opportunity. Early adolescence is a crucial period for brain development where many challenges begin to emerge. It is also a time of opportunity when rapid changes can be harnessed to set adolescents on a positive path. Puberty initiates intense hormonal changes when the brain is forming better and faster connections between systems, improving the ability to make decisions, solve problems, understand consequences, and to gain more control over emotions and behavior. At the same time, the adolescent brain goes through a period of greater sensitivity to social evaluation and emotional reactions. Increased sensation-seeking, interest in social relationships, and exploration of identity all begin to emerge. Early adolescence brings on broadening experiences, acquisition of new skills, and formation of social networks that will have lasting impacts for the rest of a young person's life. To learn more, download the new publication, The Adolescent Brain, a second window of opportunity, on the link below.
Thank you. So that's a super helpful resource as well. But I am whizzing through some of these slides because possibly some of the more chunkier stuff is coming slightly later on. So what we're now going to kind of explore a bit further is brain injury related behaviours versus neurotypical kind of related behaviours in adolescence. So again, I'm going to go a bit quicker through these slides, but please, if you have any more questions, just pop them in the chat box and we can chat further at the end. I'm just really trying to manage time appropriately. So my specialism is within TBI. So acquired brain injury is your umbrella term for any injury to the brain that has happened throughout somebody's life. This can be due to infection, stroke, tumours. There's lots and lots of causes of an acquired brain injury, one of which is a traumatic brain injury. So if we look on the next slide, we can see that a TBI can be caused by, again, varying different reasons: fall, assault, road traffic accident. I largely work in road traffic accident. Traumatic brain injuries can be open or closed. I largely work in closed road traffic accidents. An open injury is when the skull has been fractured, and it often results in focal damage, so just a specific area that has sustained an injury. But with traumatic brain injuries as well, you have your initial injury, but you can have secondary, third, multiple injuries after that. So that is just something to really bear in mind. Now, the severity of TBI, there's lots of different severity markers, really, that are used to kind of identify how severe a TBI is. But on that note as well, I just want to mention that there's so much research to indicate that although, we might categorize brain injuries as mild or severe, there's really no such thing as a mild TBI, because even some of those symptoms that somebody may present with, they can really suffer from throughout all of their life. So is any TBI mild? But that's just a philosophical question for today. So yes, we can look at the Glasgow Coma Scale, how long a person has been in a coma for, the amount of bleeding and swelling. So again, you might see them in your secondary and third injuries. So diffuse damage also kind of links with your coop and contra-coop. So inside the skull, it's not smooth. It's actually like kind of got bony ridges and shearing. So depending on the force, because the brain is suspended in cerebral spinal fluid, you can get lots of movement in the ways that the brain shouldn't be moved. So not only can it have additional impact on the inside of the skull, which can then cause kind of a diffuse scatter injury, that kind of twisting and turning can cause bleeding, swelling within the deep connections, pathways of the brain, and cause further hemorrhaging. So yes, the pathways and connections can be further damaged. Any lack of oxygen or starvation of oxygen can affect, again, the deep structures within the brain. With traumatic brain injury, you can often have multiple impact sites. Again, that will indicate how severe a brain injury is, and the level and length of post-traumatic amnesia would indicate how severe a traumatic brain injury is. Okay, so bearing in mind that we've just spoken about how severe TBI maybe, it's also important to kind of remember, and I'm going to discuss this slightly on, so maybe I'm skipping ahead here. But appearance can often be a bias in terms of when we are judging behaviour. So just want you to bear that in mind now as we start to look further into behaviour, what's expected, and how we can begin to differentiate. And firstly, how do we judge appropriate behaviour? Okay, so another resource that I regularly use within my sessions is 5 Against the Law. And within this resource, it shares that a behaviour level, essentially then a judgment on behaviour, can change depending on 3 factors. So who you're with, where you are, and how old you are. So if we use the example of teenagers swearing, okay, it's very common. If they are a teenager and they're swearing with their friends, that's actually possibly a reasonable and expected behaviour. If they were doing so aggressively at their teacher, that would be seen as an aggressive or an intimidating behaviour, and it's therefore not appropriate. So how we all judge appropriate behaviour, I think there's largely kind of social rules that we all understand, but that does also differ as well, depending on our socio-economic, cultural beliefs and biases. But we do need to be mindful of attribution biases as well, especially being the adults. So an attribution bias is the error we kind of make when we evaluate people's behaviour and try to find reasons for their behaviour versus our behaviour. And we can be biased when we judge what's acceptable behaviour. So if we think of the example of using mobiles at the dinner table, there may be, as the adults, we may say, do not have your phone at the dinner table. But then if our phone rings, do we answer it? So we can be quite comfortable about ourselves and be like, oh, well, it was a work call. I really needed to answer. It was really important. It pays the bills. You know, your Instagram message isn't important. So we are quite comfortable with our own behaviours and our own reasoning, but we might have inappropriate judgments about others and have a tendency to put that down to their characteristics. So, well, I was doing this because I was being good, I was being helpful, but they were doing that because they were intentionally being disruptive. It's that kind of bias. Now, behaviour without any context is very, very difficult to interpret. And this will include any triggers, so any antecedents and build-up of that behaviour, but also then how that behaviour is reinforced. So if somebody says like, oh, we're having loads of problems, he keeps telling jokes. So we might think, well, why is that a problem? you know, we might think, well, if he's telling jokes and people are laughing, that's okay, that's being positively reinforced. But when we dig a bit deeper, it might be that the client is repeating the same jokes, which are really not appropriate to younger children and is causing problems. So we need to have the behavior as a whole and the person as a whole to understand exactly what's going on. And behaviors are really seen on a spectrum. So the duration of a behavior, the severity of the behavior, and the frequency of that behavior will define that spectrum of challenging behavior. I don't think I worded that very well, but hopefully that makes sense. So if we pop onto the next slide and start to kind of really think about whether a TBI caused the behavior, or is the behavior that we're seeing within the client population is related to a TBI. What I really want to add here is that it's absolutely essential that we have a really good understanding of TBI specific considerations and challenges. So, and the reason for that is because these factors will support with our ability to identify if a behaviour is more likely to be TBI related or non-TBI related. And I do reflect on some of those considerations shortly, but for now, I'm going to kind of talk in a very, very, very broad sense. So a behaviour may be more likely to be TBI related if it's really severe and unusual, it's independent of the context, so out of the blue. We do need to be mindful sometimes when we have reports of, oh, it's out of the blue, and we might often hear goes from 0 to 100 straight away. And whilst those may be true, sometimes it with a bit of gentle digging, we can find, and reflection, hindsight's a wonderful thing, we can see that actually there may have been some kind of build up, some trigger. But you know, if those are not present, then it is more likely to be TBI related. Remorse is vitally important. How, you know, somebody may show remorse or may not show any remorse or any insight, or recollection even of the behavior, or how they may you know, store and kind of reshare that memory as well. Again, lots of TBI considerations within that, such as confabulation, difficulties with telling their side of the story due to narrative or cognitive communication skills. So again, this is where we can start to see that there's so many kind of intermingling TBI factors that also need to be balanced. If somebody's really dismissive of social evaluation, because again, teenagers are very sensitive to that social evaluation. So just as a small example, one of the girls that I work with, and I've worked with her for a long time, her behaviours have really changed over the years. And we were recently kind of out in the community, and she, you know, she really was expressing her distress really loud, very, very vocal, lots of expletives, super colourful, and she was completely dismissive of social evaluation, which is really out of character for her as well. You know, she's very sensitive, as we all were when we were teenagers. You know, we want to be part of the in-group. So that's just one example of how we might think, oh, actually, this may be more likely to be related to the TBI. Also, if the behaviour is consistently repeated, and the reason why I say about repetition is because people with a TBI can learn very differently and don't necessarily learn from those previous experiences. So if you have a teenager who does something, say at school, that does not have positive reinforcement from the peers, it's very unlikely that they would continuously repeat that behaviour. If they are doing so, you may attribute that to being more likely to be caused by TBI. So it doesn't need to have those factors don't all need to be present to say, well, this is definitely a TBI. And we're possibly not ever always going to be able to say this is absolutely due to the TBI, this absolutely isn't. But these are really supportive factors in trying to differentiate and identify what is typical teenage risk-taking, sassiness versus something that may be symptomatic of a traumatic brain injury. So less likely, you might see kind of modest behaviours, mild behaviours, typical behaviours, not wanting to revise for the GCSE. I think every teenager has probably felt that at some point in their life. Really dependent on the context, you can quite clearly see that there's a very clear cause and effect. And sometimes when we're looking at that, we might also think, I'd have probably responded in the same way. I understand why she, told somebody to go away in a colourful, with colourful use of language. They have insight. They are aware of what they have done. They are aware of the consequences, how it's impacted other people. They have insight into the fact that they acted out of character, and to absolutely not repeat that again because of that social evaluation and learning from previous experience. So those factors would indicate that perhaps this is more likely just due to neurotypical teenage behaviour. Okay, so this was a study that was completed, and the references there regarding the perspectives of neuro rehab staff on behaviour. So whether they were going to attribute that to BI related or non-BI related. And there was kind of these 5 different themes, really. So behaviour, very similar to how we've just discussed, really. Staff would kind of consider physical aggression, either towards themselves or others, really sexualized behavior, fecal smearing perhaps to brain injury related behaviors, whereas kind of other behaviors such as problems with emotional regulation or verbal aggression would be attributed to just being a teenager. But again, as well, I think we need to also recognise that when somebody sustains a TBI, they have significant kind of personality, behavioural and emotional regulation changes due to, largely due to the area which has sustained the injury. So one of I was meeting care staff recently, and they shared that one of my clients was completely inconsolable. She was absolutely devastated, really, really upset. And then somebody complimented the shoes, and she just switched. She was like, "Oh, thank you so much," and started talking about TikTok or something like that. So that client does in particular have real difficulty regulating her emotions, but that kind of switch in itself is so extreme that you would not attribute that to kind of expected teenage behavior. So again, even within these large themes, there are individual differences and lots of things we need to weigh up. And that's also why it's really important to have a real concrete understanding of traumatic brain injury. So that's kind of actually just linked on to the extremeness of behaviour. So as I've just explained, kind of the more extreme of the behaviour, the more likely it is to be judged as brain injury related. Control's another factor. And I think that also kind of really links to remorse that we were just kind of speaking about on the next slide. So some examples of that might be saying sorry immediately, but then continuing with the behaviour and not being aware that they're doing so. But then we've also got considerations such as frontal lobe paradox. I'll speak about that shortly. Lack of insight and awareness, and the inability to self-monitor. There's also attribution biases dependent on appearance following a brain injury. So it's unfortunate, but that is something that I have also experienced with my clients as well. Biases based and judgments based on how somebody looks, and that they can often mask their difficulties as well. Normality was also raised in this study. For example, kind of associating behaviours with a brain injury because the client has a brain injury. But actually, if you took a step back, it's kind of that evaluation of, oh, actually, this is how teenagers may generally act. But just again, my comments then. So the flip side of this could be that a brain injury related behaviour has become completely normalised to a family or care team. I see this a lot again with my clients. And also something else I've seen is that either staff or family aren't quite attuned to those TBI nuances and can miss behaviours or possible vulnerabilities by associating it with expected behaviour. But then the client themselves are really struggling in terms of their regulation or problem solving, which actually leads to increased risk taking or increased social vulnerability either online or in the community. So next slide. Sorry, that was chunky. So if we just look here as well at some kind of pre-injury factors which are linked to the risk of injury, but they're also really linked and influence one another. So, you know, if an individual is from a low socioeconomic background, they have increased risk of social emotional mental health needs, speech, language, and communication needs. That can then increase the risk of challenging or offending behaviour, which can increase the risk of a brain injury, increased risk of exclusion. You know, we're getting the picture. It all really links, and sometimes it's the chicken or the egg, which one came first. And just as a clinician, as practitioners, we need to be absolutely mindful of all of these different factors. Because if we aren't wearing multicolored lenses for all of these different factors, we're going to miss something. So we can't, as a speech and language therapist, I can't just have my yellow speech and language therapy glasses on. I've got to have my pink SEMH glasses on too. I've got to be considering constantly TBI challenges and factors. So you have got to have multiple lenses on at one time and being able to weigh up all of those different factors. Okay, so dormant effects. So TBI in childhood can result in gradual emergence of challenging behaviour. And the reason for this is because, as we've mentioned earlier on in the slides, the brain continues to develop, but development can be arrested or atypical and disrupted around the injury, specifically within the teenage years, because again, we thought of very much earlier on how much brain development is actually happening during those years. And we might see those dormant effects come into play due to that lag that we spoke about. So the lack of synchrony in the development we've previously mentioned. So when a young person is beginning to take risks, the regulatory mechanisms aren't in place to allow appropriate behaviour regulation to happen. This is, so my specialisms are TBI and SEMH, and I largely work with teenagers, but there have been some of my clients that I've worked with a lot younger, and this is absolutely a trajectory and pattern that from an anecdotal kind of experience, I can absolutely share that I see this regularly. And, you know, there's other factors again to consider within this is it's that gap between the client and the peers and their abilities gets bigger. as their peers are continuing to mature and engage, and they're continuing to see additional difficulties. But I also always reassure my clients, some things that might not always happen, but just kind of from a anecdotal observatory kind of perspective, that's absolutely something I've definitely seen within my caseload. So next slide. So just checking the time. We're now going to kind of look at the co-occurring considerations in a bit more depth. So I've been talking a lot about kind of expected behaviour or risk taking, and we do need to acknowledge that some risk taking has its place within adolescence, and much like behaviour, risk taking can really vary in severity and can again be seen on a spectrum. There's some really nice studies here, which again have popped the link in. So teenagers are much more likely to take risks with their driving if they're around the peers. And adolescent mice, unlike adult mice, consume more alcohol in the presence of peers than when alone. So that behaviour is not seen in the adult mice at all. It's just the juvenile mice. So this may not be so nice for us all to think about as the adults in the room, but there is an evolutionary function to some risk taking. So this is Hugh Williams again, so Repairing Shattered Lives report. During the teenage years, there's a surge and introduction of reward-orientated neurotransmitters and an associated increase in reward-seeking behaviour. So the emphasis is on sensation seeking, but that emphasis is not matched by the capacity for self-regulation. And that's where we kind of see the risk of adolescence kind of manifesting within itself. But from an evolutionary perspective, there's really clear advantages to this. Impressing others. This means we're going to have increased tribe, and the chances of us passing on our genes are also increased. So it's just to be mindful that there is a purpose to risk taking of a certain form. It may not be what we want for our clients or our children, but we need to bear it in mind. And what's also important to bear in mind is that from a teenager's perspective, whilst all of this is going on in the brain and in their life, absolutely nothing is happening. They have no awareness of this, and they just feel as though we as the adults are just being mean or ruining their lives, as some of them may say. But to them, nothing is happening. Okay, so this is again a really helpful article I referenced at the bottom, because really, how can we differentiate between a behaviour being caused by puberty or not? Well, risk-taking is essentially a cocktail of biological, hormonal, and psychological features, some dependent on puberty, some not. So reward sensitivity and sensation seeking, as we've discussed, is really likely to be attributed to puberty and could be seen as typical just because of that brain development and what is happening generally in the teenage brain. However, things like cognitive control and self-regulation can be independent to puberty. And again, if we're thinking with the TBI lens on, cognition and self-regulation can be two things which are significantly impacted from a traumatic brain injury or any brain injury. Okay, so TBI specifics. This for me is one of the most important slides from today. And it is just some of the TBI considerations and factors that we need to be mindful of and bear in mind when we're working with our teenage clients. But first one, fluctuating capacity. So somebody's capacity varies. For my clients, my experience has often been due to their emotional regulation and also things like fatigue, cognitive fatigue, especially impacting then like their ability to recall, engage, pay attention, process, all the things you need for capacity. And again, my clients, and is common within TBI, is sometimes if we're talking about things that are distressing, we spend a lot of time speaking about that. It actually continues to kind of put them in a threat response, which then will reduce their ability to engage appropriately, think about decisions. What we need to also remember is that all aspects of choice and decision making can be affected by a TBI, especially severe TBI. So things like generating options, evaluating and weighing up those options, implementing a plan or an option, consequential thinking and sequencing, sorry. So all of those aspects can be significantly affected. We also need to bear in mind that decisions are made based on having options. Without options, the only option may be opted for because that's better than nothing, or an option's made impulsively. And if we think about some of the risk factors for sustaining a TBI, such as low socioeconomic background or increased risk of social emotional mental health needs, how those populations are at risk of having reduced options and choices anyway. Perception of what is normal and biases. So what I mean by this, I mean a few things by this really. So I have often been on files where either from kind of the treating therapists or from the expert kind of reports, where it's suggested that a behaviour or a decision or a symptom is kind of common within low socioeconomic demographic, essentially. And whilst that may be true, again, if we consider previous slides with pre-injury factors, we don't know all these people, their individual circumstances, or their level of understanding, their level of capacity, or consent. And we always need to view our client as individual and have a duty of care for them. So that is something to bear in mind. We also need to bear in mind context of support and facilitation. So as an example, I do a lot of capacity work around social media. And one of the girls that I was working with had fluctuating capacity. And one of the reasons for that is because of her support team. So she actually had a phenomenal support team. They were amazing. They essentially were her external frontal lobes. And with that support and with that facilitation, she was able to safely use social media. However, without that, absolutely unable to safely use social media and posed huge safeguarding risks. Frontal lobe paradox. So that is where the ability to explain what someone might do in a given situation is maintained, but then their ability to act in line with that is impaired, which also then makes doing capacity assessments or any assessment or any task incredibly difficult, because you can get some of the most beautiful answers, but then you may get a incident report which shows that although somebody has explained exactly what they would do in a given situation, how they'd mitigate the risks, their ability to do that in real life is nowhere near in line with what they said they're going to do. Again, linking then to lack of insight and awareness into behaviours and ability to self-monitor. So if I say that I'm going to quit sugar, which I say regularly, but then I eat a full packet of Oreos, I am aware that I have gone against what I've said. I've done something that I probably wanted to avoid doing in the first place, and I'm really going to try and not do that over the next couple of days, and this is the plan I'm going to put in place to make sure I don't do that. all of those kind of executive skills are not always available for somebody who has sustained a TBI, and so that they will lack insight and awareness into the behaviours and ability to self-monitor. So you'll see repeated behaviours, or you might hear phrases like, "Oh, that happened ages ago. It's I don't do that anymore," when ages ago was a couple of days ago. It's not right here and now in the present, or just not able to remember that at all, and it's finished and it's gone. So why is everybody still worried and talking about it? Low cognitive reserve. So again, this is often something I hear is that well, their pre-morbid history, they may have had low attainment levels in school, so things aren't that much different for them now. It's actually completely inaccurate. There's lots of research now to show that the kind of two biggest contributing factors in positive recovery is your pre-functioning kind of levels before the injury and how much support you've got, family, all the rest of it. So if you have a low cognitive reserve, so low backdrop, difficulty with cognition or additional needs before the injury, that actually makes the injury and the recovery even worse. We've discussed dormant effects already, and then we also have kind of significant TBI indicators that we always need to bear in mind, which is executive functioning, cognition, behavioural and emotional change. I've not mentioned there about personality, and I've not mentioned there about communication, but those are also factors that are highly important, but largely link to the factors that I have popped down. And just lastly, really, a teenager with a brain injury is more vulnerable than a teenager without a brain injury. So always, when you are considering behaviours and what's happening for your client, that needs to be that needs to be beared in mind. You need to consider that and be mindful that somebody with a TBI is not going to be able to move on, learn from, mitigate risks, threats in the same way that somebody else can. So always be mindful of that. Okay, next and final slide. So just a summary for us here. Early adolescence is a time of rapid learning and brain development. It can be a period of vulnerability and also opportunity. There's an increase in sensation seeking and sensitivity to rewards, as well as motivation for social relations and sensitivity to social evaluation, but with that lowered capacity to filter immediate influences. Some risk-taking has its place and has an evolutionary function. All risk-taking takes place within context and is a combination of biological, hormonal, and psychological features, some dependent on puberty and some not. Suffering a TBI can increase risk-taking and challenging behaviour within adolescence. Different factors such as severity, context, antecedents, and insight should be considered when deducing if a behaviour is more likely to be TBI related or non-TBI related. Person-centred, choice and autonomy-led approaches are required, balanced with an understanding of TBI-specific considerations and challenges. So thank you very much for joining today and listening to me. But that is the end of me talking. I'm just going to mute myself because my dog's come upstairs.
Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for that. It was such a comprehensive overview. We've got a question which is really about asking, I know we record the video, but somebody's asking, will the JSB in Scotland's asking, will the slides be shared with all the references, as they're currently undertaking a master's dissertation looking at pre-adult brain injury and and offending risk behaviours, personality disorder traits. And they'd really like to have a look over some of the papers mentioned, and that just saying thank you very much. It's been very interesting hearing from the perspective of someone who has specialised in interventions for adolescents, where evidence shows the divergence from peers can often go unnoticed, which can contribute to poor outcomes in adulthood.
If you, oh, sorry, the feedback thing's just popped up for me. I'm going to pop my email in the box, and if you just email me, I can send you the slides.
If there's no other questions, I just need to check, because I'm a stand-in chairperson. There's a poll come up, so I presume that's shown to everybody. If you've got time to fill the poll in, that would be fantastic, please. And we've got some more comments. Emma saying, really interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So obviously, oh, that's great. I can see people answering the poll. Thank you very much. And we do have a slide, ATtraining. Obviously, we have other training available. We've got all the videos on AT Therapy YouTube channel, which is a really helpful resource. We've got Instagram accounts, and also we've got a Facebook page, so there's lots of ways to keep up with what we're offering and any resources that are available. And obviously we have more training events. We have there won't be a webinar in December because everybody's busy doing Christmas. We've got Makaton coming up, Talking Maths, which I do, which is great if anybody's interested. AAC building blocks, and then we have free CPD webinars and free CPD podcasts. So yeah, just want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody that's filling out the webinar feedback, and thank you for coming. There's lots of really lovely positive feedback in the chat, Emma. That was brilliant, so interesting. Thank you. Can we watch it back on